Hello and welcome. It's been a while. This is the first of potentially quite a few videos on John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. This is a copy with On Liberty and the subjection of women as well, but I'm going to focus on utilitarianism right now. Specifically, and kind of for the first time, I'm going to move away from a book review or a philosophical review and move towards doing kind of philosophy within the video, or more of an investigation and an investigation into previous works, those being Moral Tribes and The Righteous Mind, which were the two series before this. Specifically, I'm going to use utilitarianism to support Joshua Greene's defense of utilitarianism within his book, and also kind of map utilitarianism onto The Righteous Mind just a little bit as a precursor to later videos. I may end up with something like 8 videos with using utilitarianism because it's very deep and useful as a framework to view other perspectives. So today I'm going to kind of give a brief overview of what utilitarianism is according to John Stuart Mill, and then kind of go through Jonathan Haidt just a little bit before moving on to Joshua Greene. Hopefully this isn't just me talking for 45 minutes, but I expect this to be a longer video, so I'll get started right away. So first thing, utilitarianism is a moral framework that is based on the way we would put it now, I think, in popular discourse is harm. Specifically, it's based on the pleasure principle, you could say, where we ought to act according to our ability to optimize happiness for as many people as possible without making others unhappy in the process. So utilitarianism is a consequentialist ethic. So it specifically focuses on, sometimes to the exclusion of other pieces, it focuses on the consequences of your actions. So as opposed to the means themselves of coming to some consequence. So the consequence in this case is happiness for individuals. And it's sort of in the moral psych literature right now, it's juxtaposed with deontology, of course, which is more of a focus on not using individuals as a means to an end, but as a means in themselves, or an end in themselves. And so obviously utilitarianism is viewed in this framework as emphasizing the ends while potentially using people as a means, or not really considering the means themselves. So that's kind of a basic rundown, specifically within the psych literature. Just a few kind of introductory notes, kind of context, stuff that didn't really fit with Greene or Haidt that I wanted to include in this video as opposed to some other video. First is that John Stuart Mill labels our moral faculty as a branch of reason, not sensation, which is rationalist, obviously. Although he does admit or concede, or maybe a less insulting term, he allows for the fact that first principles or a priori principles are those that can't be understood or grasped specifically by reason. They have to be grasped by some other method, potentially sensation, potentially intuition, but generally the moral faculty is one of reason, specifically in decision making in Mill's view. Also, we are growing towards a universal society where cooperation is paramount. So with that, I have so many notes for these videos, so I'll be jumping around a lot, but hopefully I can keep it together. Let's see. So we're growing towards universal society, and by cooperating, we end up identifying our ends with those of those we cooperate with. So, which is obvious, but also deep and insightful. So when we cooperate with people, obviously if we're actually cooperating, we have to be cooperating towards some goal. And if we're cooperating with any degree of effectiveness, the goal that we share is the same to a proportional degree to the extent to which we are cooperating. So if we're perfectly working together, our goals aren't necessarily one and the same. Our explicit goals are one and the same. Like if I'm working with, I don't want to say a classmate because I'm going to talk about like lying and stuff, but if say someone is working with, let's say a United States representative ambassador is working with a Russian ambassador, explicitly they're working together to build a peace treaty or whatnot, but maybe covertly or subvertly they are also working towards their own ends, the ends of their country they're representing, and working towards more selfish ends. So we aren't necessarily 100% cooperating towards the same goal if we're cooperating really effectively, but generally if we're going to have that trust to be able to work that well together, then we need to share those same goals as precisely as possible. We don't call anything wrong unless we want to punish someone for doing that wrong. So if I think that, for example, in some cultures, taking your shoes off before you come into the house is even decided or claimed as a moral principle. If I were one of those people who viewed it that way, I wouldn't call it a moral principle unless I thought someone should be punished for not taking their shoes off before entering a house. So it wouldn't be moral or harmful in my view if I thought that, or I wouldn't think that they should be punished if I thought that it wasn't moral, and it wouldn't be moral if I didn't think they would be punished. Hopefully that's fairly clear, but maybe not. So he also kind of talks about the golden rule a little bit. Let me see if I can find a good page for it. Basically as one of the good examples of a moral principle. Yeah, I didn't write down the page number, but basically it's a sort of, he calls it an excellent encapsulation of what a utilitarian ethic would mean or manifest as, or a utilitarian person would profess as their ultimate ethic, because I do what I think that you would want, or because I know that I want it, and well, that's basically it. That's the golden rule, is that I do for others what I would want done to myself. And so in that way, I generally want to be treated well, and so I would treat other people well generally, and I generally don't want to be treated poorly, so I shouldn't treat other people poorly, which is a re-articulation of optimizing pleasure and minimizing displeasure. And he also talks about justice as paramount. The whole final section of the the essay is about justice and its relationship to utilitarianism. And so I have a little section here. Let's see. At the very end of the book, justice remains the appropriate name for certain social utilities which are vastly more important and therefore more absolute and imperative than any others are as a class, and which, therefore, ought to be, as well as naturally are, guarded by a sentiment not only different in degree, but also in kind, distinguished from the milder feeling which attaches to the mere idea of promoting human pleasure or convenience, at once by the more definite nature of its commands and by the sterner character of its sanctions. So basically, he's talking about it as a certain higher virtue over just pleasure and displeasure, a kind of meta-ethic even, that judges whether or not something is pleasurable or displeasurable. And kind of going off of that too, and earlier talking about reason as, or our moral faculty being about reason. He, of course, has this famous quote, which is something like, I'd rather be a philosopher or I think it was Socrates than, or a person than a pig in the mud, or a fool, or whatever, some individual or being who can't reason at the level that we as humans can, because reason, in his opinion, is the highest form of pleasure, as opposed to simple sensations and hedonistic pleasures. So that's basically the little rundown on utilitarianism. So I'll move on to Jonathan Haidt now. First, I think Haidt does, specifically with Bentham, but also implicitly by connection, by relation to Bentham and Mill, label Mill as deluded within his rationalist delusion context. It is very rationalist, and Greene, in fact, talks a lot about how, or a little bit about how Bentham and Mill might have come up with the only, as far as he could tell, fully rational ethic. And I think that Jonathan Haidt would probably disagree, because it is very, what was the word? Monistic, very much based on a single principle, that being pleasure or happiness, or you could even say, in a certain way, harm. And Jonathan Haidt neither agrees that we should think about things like this, or morality, as in monistic terms, either as pleasure or specifically as harm, explicitly as harm. He disagrees with that statement, or that label of morality, in which we talk about it as fundamentally about harm, because even if it is, in his opinion, there are also kind of manifestant other values that allow us to perceive the world in a bit more, with more nuance, like his moral foundations. And so he does talk about kind of first principles. Mill does talk about first principles as being only accessible by something other than reason, something like intuition or sensation. And Haidt would see this likely as a sort of as an argument with certain gaps, because why are you trying to reason then to morality if these first principles, these a priori principles, are only accessible by something other than reason? And so maybe one of the more, that was the first section, but maybe one of the more interesting pieces of this video is that it seems almost like utilitarianism maps on to moral foundations theory, or you could say that it's the other way around, but I think it's utilitarianism on top of moral foundations, because it shares certain foundations by the looks of it. I perceived that it kind of mapped onto fairness, oppression, authority, and the care foundations. So I'll kind of give a rundown on that, not quickly, but if I can get there quickly, because I thought that was fascinating. If I can find it. This isn't a long book, but it is very complex and difficult to find things sometimes. So here's one example that I labeled with the Care Harm Foundation. Mill is talking about justice, talking about vengeance. The natural feeling of retaliation or vengeance is rendered by the intellect, and sympathy applicable to those injuries, that is, to those hurts which wound us through or in common with society at large. So kind of empathy, feeling like you should care about other people. There's certain instances like that that seem, you could say, indirectly, to some degree, indirectly related to moral foundations. Here's another on fairness, talking about personal liberty, talking about property, basically that it would be unjust to take away those things. Talking about the legal rights of which he is deprived. Let's see, here's one on authority. Fourthly, it is confessedly unjust to break faith with anyone, to violate an engagement, either express or implied, and so on and so forth. Here's one on oppression, talking about equality, specifically that of everyone is equally deserving of pleasure or happiness. And so there are certain instances like that that specifically fit onto those four foundations that I found, and that I'm interested in kind of explicating more and thinking about more and talking about it more. And so I thought that was really interesting to just kind of look at Haidt's thinking and two of his kind of primary components of the righteous mind through a utilitarian framework, which is more something that we would see with Greene than Haidt. But so that pretty much finishes the Haidt section. So I'll move on to Greene, which is a bit more relevant, obviously, and actually why I decided to read utilitarianism next after reading Moral Tribes, because Greene talks about utilitarianism so much. So the first is a sort of support for Greene's argument in defense of utilitarianism. So it's a sort of bidirectional defense of each other. Utility is about optimizing pleasure and minimizing pain for every individual. So, of course, there's the sort of argument from critics of utilitarianism that it's about pleasing people at the expense of other people. So there are situations in which if I do something, it would give 5 people pleasure, but it would harm one person, and we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't harm people. We should strive for not harming people because they have rights, and instead, you could say, being patient and waiting for an opportunity to help all 6 of those people, even if it's to a lesser extent, which I think proper utilitarians wouldn't disagree with, because Mill and Greene and Bentham all say that what we really ought to do is give these 5 people the most pleasure we can without inducing pain to this other one person or however many people. It's not just like there are certain instances, obviously, where in a trolley problem, if you're forced to make a decision between saving 5 people or saving the one, then the calculus is obvious, and deontologists wouldn't really disagree with that. And so it's certainly, utilitarianism is certainly a useful framework for a lot of situations, maybe less so for others, and where the decision isn't so forced on us, but really it's all encompassing, even for situations where it's not forced on us, a decision isn't forced on us. A utilitarian decision would still be one that would align fairly well with other frameworks. And so that's the first one. Mill talks about heroes and martyrs. Specifically, you could say the fallacy, that fallacious thinking that critics impose on utilitarian thinking, in that they think or critique or suggest that utilitarians believe that we ought to give everything that we possibly can as a sort of happiness pump for other people. And Mill says that's not really the case. In a utilitarian ethic, you ought to be capable of that if necessary, and in an imperfect world like we live in, it may become necessary, but you don't have to until it becomes so. And so this also kind of connects with this fourth section that I'm going to bring up. That being, you only have the you could say obligation or even the opportunity to affect a sort of universal happiness calculation if you have the requisite capacity for social responsibility, for social impact. So maybe the United States president could really effectively impact the world, but myself, within my little community, maybe I can do some real good, but other than that, I don't have so much of a voice or an impact. And so I don't really have that responsibility placed onto me to perform universal acts of good. And so that connects obviously to being able to, in the first place, in terms of more of a psychological, character-wise explanation or investigation, in which the most virtuous within the utilitarian framework, even though there aren't really virtues in utility, those individuals, the most moral individuals, would be willing to give up everything they had for that of others if it became necessary, and those are heroes and martyrs. He talks about rights, which Greene labels as a sort of rhetorical device rather than something that actually exists in any meaningful way. Basically, John Stuart Mill agrees or proposed that before Greene did. And so he talks about rights as a sort of only a legitimate and authorized expectation within a society. So we've kind of agreed to these different things that are owed to us, and so we expect them to be owed to us. But if we hadn't agreed to them, then there's nothing to say that those rights are a priori existent. But they should be something that society should defend, which Greene also agrees with, when they're good and they perform utilitarian function. Mill also talks about utilitarian thinking as being built in to our psyche, as does Greene. Greene specifically talks about intuition and his automatic settings in how we view the world, and how we ought to use those automatic settings in me versus us situations, as opposed to us versus them situations. And so Greene especially kind of, you could say, fills out utilitarian thinking or Mill's thinking in this context with his psychological perspective, as opposed to the philosophical framework that Mill proposed, and kind of gives the practical directions for how we ought to act. Mill talks about how it being natural to resent harm to those we care about, which of course is super relevant and fundamental to social and moral psychology. Obviously, within us versus them context, we have people we care about and people who we care about less or don't care about at all, or even hate. And if those people were to harm someone that we loved, like our family, like our community, like those we identify with, then obviously we would be angry about that. And so Greene also talks about kind of that us versus them and me versus us distinction and how we ought to go about that. And so finally, Mill implies the need for a metamorality. So in fact, Mill kind of proposes utility, or first suggests that a metamorality, implicitly he suggests this, that a metamorality should, we should build one, and then later, 2 pages later, suggests utility or utilitarianism as that metamorality. So he kind of talks about there being certain maxims, different maxims, free will not existing, social contracts being a farce. Specifically, he says, no one of them, those being those moral maxims, can carry out his own notion of justice without trampling upon another equally binding. So there are certain competing maxims, and so they're actually valid in his view, but what we need is something to help us decide between those maxims. He says, the one looks to what it is just that the individual should receive, the other to what it is just that the community should give. Kind of talking back to the sort of Haidt political discourse in terms of, you could map that onto liberals versus conservatives, and that liberals might look to see what the community should give, and conservatives would look to individuals should receive, or the other way around even. And so, let's see. Social utility alone can decide this preference, that being the preference between moralities or ethical principles. And so the more I read this, the more unoriginal Joshua Greene seemed. Obviously, the psychological and neuroscientific evidence that Greene gives is new, not necessarily all his work, but the synthesis in defending utilitarianism is newer, and specifically some of his work is new and novel, and he was the first really to kind of bring about that deontological and utilitarianism distinction in moral psychology, but a lot of his work was really just supporting Mill's and others' framework of morality. And so I thought that was fascinating, and one of the reasons why I felt like I had to talk about these 2 books after reading Utilitarianism, as opposed to just talking about the essay itself. And so I think next I'm going to kind of work through other videos that are similar in nature but are a bit more using utilitarianism to work through psychological problems that aren't necessarily within the righteous mind or moral tribes. Some newer stuff that I'm going to be working on and writing about. We'll see when that is. I'm going to finish at least a new book tonight, and I might talk about that a little bit for the next video. But other than that, I need to read the Moral Psychology Handbook still, and hopefully I can start working on churning out some chapter videos for that. But other than that, hopefully I can get some papers written from my my thoughts on utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill, and then make videos about it. But we'll see when that is. It might be not until this summer that the first video comes out. This summer for me, so after May 12th or so, that week after. But hopefully I can produce some videos until then. I hope this video was interesting and kind of a different take than you've seen before, and thank you very much for watching.